This is the B-24D. It is a large airplane, but that in itself does not mean that it is difficult or tricky to fly. It is obviously impossible to learn to fly by merely looking at a moving picture. However, it is hoped that picturizing the procedure for preparation, takeoff, and landing will be of some help by making each operation and the reason for it a little clearer. This film on how to fly the B-24 is based on an appendix appearing in the Consolidated Flight Manual. This is a serious film. It is not entertainment. Nor is it truly an instruction film, since the subject is too complicated for teaching by this method alone. The picture can, however, help you to become a little more familiar with the things you must see and do in handling the B-24. If it accomplishes this, your time and our effort will be well spent. The operation of any airplane, single or multi-engine, requires certain operations performed in a definite sequence. This sequence, as it applies to the B-24D, is covered by a complete and explicit pilot's checklist. This list must be followed exactly and intelligently. We will cover each step of this checklist from the time the crew first approaches the airplane until they return to the field from their flight. And now, as the crew approaches the airplane, the flight engineer proceeds to open up. He unlocks and opens the small access door on the right side of the fuselage, and reaching in, opens the bomb doors by pulling outward on the handle of the auxiliary bomb door valve. The seasoned pilot makes certain that the pitot head covers are removed. He knows that the airspeed indicator is inoperative with them on, and that it's awkward to remove them in flight. With the ship open, the pilot and co-pilot enter first and go forward to the cockpit. The flight engineer then enters. His first act is to turn on the 4 fuel selector valves. There is a valve for each engine, which is marked to connect the engine to a correspondingly numbered fuel system, or to the cross connection, which interconnects all valve units. The valves are located overhead. 2 on the right of the center line, forward of the main spar, control flow to engines 3 and 4. The 2 valves on the left side control flow to engines 1 and 2. Off, on tank, on cross connection. The engineer next checks the fuel load. This is done at the 2 visual gauges located on the forward face of the bomb bay bulkhead. Each gauge is connected by a 2-way valve with 2 of the 4 main fuel systems. By operating these valves, the quantity of fuel in each of the 4 systems can be determined. The inclinometer, located outboard of the gauges, must read 0 for accurate gauge reading. An off-zero reading can cause a high % of inaccuracy in gauging the fuel available. Systems 3 and 4 are on the inboard gauge, and systems 1 and 2 on the outboard gauge. All figures read in United States gallons. Refraction through that part of the glass filled with liquid changes the angles of the diagonal lines in back of the plastic tube and simplifies reading. Each system should have a minimum of 300 gallons, giving a total for the 4 systems of 1,200 United States gallons. In the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot adjust their seats. The seat adjusting levers located outboard of each seat permit adjustment fore and aft, up and down, and tilt. Comfortable adjustment of the seats accomplished, the rudder pedals are set for proper length. Each pedal adjustment ratchet is located between the pedals. Push the ratchet lever away from the pedal with the toe and move the pedal fore or aft to the proper position, like this. Be sure all seat and pedal latches are firmly engaged. Now the co-pilot removes the controls lock, which holds the locking lever up in the lock position, and stows the strap securely in the overhead. Take up all the slack and secure the loose end so it won't slap your face. After this is done, check the locking lever in down to make sure that it is all the way down and the locks are completely released. With the controls unlocked, the pilot checks the movement and direction of the controls in the normal manner. The co-pilot or engineer simultaneously visually checks the actual movement of each control. Turning the wheel this way, the ailerons. The flight engineer calls out right or left, aileron down, up. By wiggling the controls this way, the pilot can check for free movement. Now the elevators. By exercising the wheel fore and aft, like this, the elevators are checked for position and movement. The flight engineer calls out, elevators down, elevators up, then a faster movement to check for free operation. Now the rudder movement. The flight engineer calls out, right and left rudder. Now rapid movement for a freedom check. These checks might seem superfluous, but controls have been found crossed after re-rigging. And now we're ready to begin the approved procedure for starting the engines. Before the engineer approaches the engines, the co-pilot must check the ignition switches off and the master ignition switch off. A kickback would result in serious injury to the engineer. Each engine must be pulled through by hand 6 blades, 2 complete revolutions, to warn of the presence or to clear fuel accumulated in the combustion chambers, which would damage the engine. Keep clear of the plane of propeller rotation. Don't become careless. The ignition switch off can be just like the famous unloaded gun. For starting the engines, power can be drawn 1 from the ship itself by using the batteries plus the auxiliary power unit, or 2 from outside the ship by using a battery card. For starting either way, the generator switches located on the generator panel are turned off. If the start is made with outside power from the battery cart, the plug connection is reached through the small access door on the right-hand side of the fuselage. The battery switches, located over the master switch on the right side of the cockpit, are turned off for starting with the battery cart. When starting on ship's power, turn on these battery switches first. Then start the auxiliary power unit. If the batteries are fully charged, start the unit by power. Equalizer switch on, fuel on, prime. Press the starter button. The generator then acts as a starting motor to turn the engine of the unit. If the batteries are low, to start by hand, wind the starter rope around the drum. Fuel on, prime, and pull the lanyard to turn the engine over. When it is running, turn the equalizer switch on. Now, turn on the 4 ignition switches. 4, 3, 2, and 1. And the master switch. As the engineer leaves to stand by the engines, he reaches overhead on the right side and turns on the switch for the electric hydraulic pump, which furnishes hydraulic power until number 3 engine starts. Wheel chocks, if available, are placed in front of each wheel. Even if chocks are used, the pilot sets the parking brake to keep the airplane from rolling when the engines start. Just press the pedals and lift the latch. The co-pilot turns on the alternating current power switch to either number 1 or number 2 inverter, which furnishes power for the engine instruments. Automatic flight control is checked off. The slide bar control left of the pedestal is pulled aft to disengage. If the automatic flight control is on, free operation of the controls is impossible. You can see here that the pilot is really tugging to try and move the controls. De-icer and anti-icer controls to right of pedestal on the panel are checked off. De-icers on will change the wing characteristic. The intercooler switches, forward and center on the pedestal, are thrown to open. Closed intercoolers would cause overheating and detonation. The cowl flap switches, right on the pedestal, are placed in the open position and so held until the cowl flaps are fully opened. They must be fully open to permit air circulation to cool the engines during the start and warm-up period. The complete cycle from closed to open takes about 30 seconds. The propellers are set for high RPM. The switch bar is held to INC, or increased revolutions, until indicator lights on the center of the panel flash on. All 4 supercharger controls are set to off, which opens the engine exhaust tailgates. If engines are started with turbo controls on, the tailgate would be closed and the exhaust tailpipe would probably be blown out. Mixture controls are checked in idle cutoff before the boosters are turned on. The airplane fire extinguisher valves, located outboard of the co-pilot, are checked for position so that they can be operated quickly if needed. There are 2 selectors. The rear one directs gas to engines 3 and 4, and the one forward to engines 1 and 2. Furthermore, the flight engineer or mechanic always stands by starting engines with a large portable extinguisher. Engines are started in the order of 3, 4, 2, and 1. They're started from inboard to outboard so that the engineer does not have to walk through or toward a moving propeller. Number 3 engine is started first because the only engine-driven hydraulic pump is attached to it. The co-pilot looks to see that all personnel and obstructions are clear of the propellers and checks all clear with the engineer. Then the fuel booster pumps are turned on. Booster pressure is required for priming and to ensure an adequate fuel pressure until the engine-driven pumps take hold. While the pilot opens number 3 throttle 1/3, energizing the starter is accomplished by the co-pilot holding the number 3 energizer switch to accel. With his other hand, the co-pilot primes the number 3 engine. For better prime, the switch is pressed intermittently to inject the fuel in spurts. The accel position is held for 12 seconds and then the crank switch is thrown. Meanwhile, the accel switch is held on to keep the starter turning during cranking. When the engine fires on the priming charge, the mixture control is thrown from idle cutoff to auto lean. Auto lean is used for starting, warm-up, and taxiing. Auto rich, or full rich, gives an abnormally rich mixture at low speeds and will foul the plugs or load the engine. With the mixture control and idle cutoff, there is no flow of fuel, but as soon as the lever is moved from idle cutoff, a valve is opened and fuel flows to the carburetor jets. Therefore, if the engine does not run immediately, return the mixture control lever to idle cutoff to prevent flooding, a critical fire hazard. For warm-up, the mixture control remains in auto lean. With number 3 running, start engine number 4. Throttle open 1/3, accelerate, prime, crank, mixture control to auto lean. Next, engine number 2. Throttle open 1/3, accelerate, prime, crank, mixture control to auto lean. Engine number 1, throttle open 1/3, accelerate, prime, crank. This one fails to fire immediately. Mixture control is returned to idle cutoff. Now, with added prime, it takes hold, so back to auto lean. With engine number 1 started and running, the instruments of all 4 engines are checked and warm-up begins. Keep an eye on the engine instruments during warm-up. Warm up slowly so that the oil has ample time to start circulating freely. Turn off boosters. Never exceed 1,400 revolutions per minute in auto lean on the ground. Now with the engines running at 1,000 RPM, the pilot checks all gauges. The oil pressure drops to the operating range as the temperature rises. Oil pressure 45 to 50 pounds. Fuel pressure 14 pounds. Manifold pressure 15 inches. Warm up until the oil temperature gauges indicate 40 to 60 degrees centigrade. Engines 1 and 2 on the left gauge and 3 and 4 on the right. The head temperature gauges likewise have two hands, 1 and 2 left, 3 and 4 right. There are two vacuum pumps, one on engine number 1 and one on engine number 2. While the engines are warming up, check both pumps. The selector valve is located under the generator panel. The faceplate gives each source of vacuum and to where the supply is directed. It has no off position. At 1,000 RPM, the vacuum gauge on the pilot's panel should read from 4 to 4.5 inches. Now check the brake pressure. The gauges should read between 850 and 1125 pounds. Throw the de-icer lever, located to the left of the co-pilot's control column under the switch panel, to the right, to on, and see that the de-icer boots inflate and deflate. The de-icer boots are in segments, so it's necessary to check each one. Right outboard section, the vacuum pump inflates and deflates the alternate tubes. Section outboard of engines, inflate and deflate the alternate tubes. Section between engines, inflate, deflate, and inflate alternate tubes. Section between engine and fuselage, and also the tail group. The pump inflates, deflates, and inflates the alternate tubes. When this check is completed, turn the de-icer control off and check the anti-icer fluid flow to the propellers. The fluid motors are operated by this rheostat on the panel behind the mixture controls. It is calibrated in gallons per hour. For clarity, flow of fluid is shown with the propeller idle. When the propeller is revolving, the fluid runs out along the blade. Turn the fluid off when the check is completed. Wheel blocks are removed. And when the last crew member enters the airplane, he closes the bomb doors by pulling on the auxiliary bomb door handle under the flight deck on the right side. The handle must be held until the doors are closed. When the brake pedals are pressed, the spring-loaded parking brake lever automatically disengages and releases the parking brakes. Before taxiing away from the line, the pilot again checks the propellers for high RPM by throwing the bar of the propeller switch to increase. When the propellers are in high RPM, the 4 governor limit lights are illuminated. Now we're ready to go. The wise pilot taxis the plane to the head of the runway for the final run-up and preparation so that he can take off immediately thereafter and avoid the fouled engines inevitably caused by long idling. The maneuver of turning to taxi from the line should be executed in a broad, sweeping turn like this. with the power for the turn being furnished by the outboard engines. The brakes should be used very little, if at all, in taxiing, and then only applied gently. There is ample control with the outboard engine. You can see how easily the airplane can be maneuvered and controlled as it is being deliberately S-turned with the outboard engines. The B-24D is a large airplane, but when properly handled and kept under control by mild use of power and brakes, it can be handled as easily as a small plane. Notice how the inboard wheel is turning at a generous radius. The tires are not skidding, and the nose wheel is not canted at an extreme angle. This is the way not to handle an airplane. There is absolutely no excuse for abusing an airplane in this manner. If it were even moderately loaded, such violent application of the brakes would in all probability cause nose wheel failure. Abrupt turns like this are prohibited. Notice that the inboard tire is twisting and that the nose wheel is canted at an extreme angle. It is against the stops and it's sliding. And now the B-24D, without violent abuse of brakes, taxis to the head of the runway. Reel 2 of this series deals with final run-up, takeoff, use of flaps, preparation for landing, the safety checks which must be made before the airplane touches the ground, and finally, the securing after flight.